In this video, we're going to look at 5 things that every photographer should know about Photoshop. Let's begin now. The first and probably the most important thing for any photographer is to know your exposure to not be too bright or too dark. Now, if you take a picture and you take it on the back of your camera, it's hard to tell if it's really too bright or too dark. You can look at the histogram and that will very much help you. In Photoshop, you have the idea to choose the histogram and to edit based on the histogram facts. If you go to Image, down to Adjustments, over to Levels, or Control L or Command L on a Mac, it opens up this menu, and we can see the histogram showing what's bright and what's dark. The far right side of the screen is the highlights, what is completely bright. The far left side is the shadows, what is completely dark. At 0, it is black. At 255, it is completely white, at least for that channel. And right now we're looking at red, green, blue, all the channels that the camera takes. I could make it each one, but for now, for beginner photographers, we're going to do all of them together. I can also use the middle slider to adjust the midtones, to make it brighter without washing it out or making it too dark. It makes adjustments that sometimes I'll use it to just brighten up the shadows just a little bit because the sun was too bright and had too many shadows. And that works pretty good. With this picture, one thing I wanted to point out is the background is actually much brighter than the foreground, which the foreground is the subject with this purple flower. So how can we see that? Well, the histogram tool under the levels can be a very helpful way to know if it's too bright or too dark, or what is the brightest thing in the scene. Now, if I go to my levels and I hold Alt on the keyboard, Option of the Mac, I hold Alt and I drag, and eventually I move until something becomes completely changed in the screen there. It's black if it's not overexposed, but here all the blue channels and some of the green channels that mix to be a cyan color, and what's white, the red, green, and blue channels are completely overexposed, completely white in this scene. As I adjust, I see, okay, now my flower is getting to be too bright. But what I can tell then by this information is that as I move it to the left, the sidewalk is much brighter than the flower. Now our eye is drawn to bright things. We're like bees. We're attracted to bright, colorful objects. And if this is too bright in the background, I need to make an adjustment. I can go ahead and brighten it a little bit to brighten the whole scene, but I also need to tone down the darkness of the shadows. And I'll show you how to do that here in a little bit. For this scene, we see that actually things are a little bit too bright on the flower. I can tell that by looking at it with years of experience, but I go back to Image, Adjustments, and down to Levels, Control L or Command L on a Mac, and I can see that the histogram is completely cut off. The mountain range is cut right in half. It's peaked all the way. I know that something is too bright just by looking at the histogram. If I hold Alt, and I click and drag like I did before, I can see what is too bright. Notice the tips of the petals on the left side are too bright. They're overexposed and they're white. So not just the one channel, but all the channels are too bright. We're talking like a half stop too bright. So, and ideally, we turn it darker in camera, but we don't have that option right now. But it does tell us that this is too bright. So we can maybe tone the midtones down to maybe compensate for that a little bit. But unless we have the raw editing file, we can not really get the full detail back. I can turn it back a little bit here, but it just kind of gets muddy gray. If I had the raw file, I could turn the highlights down, but that's for another time and another lesson. I really don't want to do much to darken it because it doesn't look quite right. So I hit OK. But I know what is overexposed because of the histogram. It's a tool, a crutch, to make good use of photography. Now with this screen, we see it's actually too dark. I know that the fall leaves are much brighter than I see on my screen, and this one's very dark, that you can probably see it on the screen, and the average person can say, this is way too dark. So I go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. Yes, there's a pattern here. And I go to Levels, because I think it's one of the easier options to brighten and darken and have some control. And I go ahead and I click, and I drag, and I can see now starting to get a little bright in the background, but my leaves are washing out. I'm getting pretty bright, maybe 2 stops, 4 times brighter. And I turned that on and off in the preview, and that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good indeed. Much better. Now I can push my leaves a little bit brighter because I want them not to be too dark. And let's go a little brighter like this. Ooh, that's too much. Back it up, just about like that. That looks better. And that's brightening up my leaves. Now, there are some dark things in the scene. We did underexposed, so we do see the shadows cut off on the left side. But I'm going to go ahead and hold Alt and drag them in a little bit to see if I can darken that a little bit. That'll change the contrast. Yeah, it does add some darkness to it. I don't know if it's good or not, but it does kind of darken that out a little bit. I'm not sure I like it. But I could darken if I needed to. So that change does help make it look brighter than what we had originally shot. And that's a good thing. Now, some scenes can be tricky. Take example, this levels histogram picture. Here, the sun is peeking around the tree, and there's no way you're going to capture the brightness of the sun and have the brightness of the grass and everything retained in the same shot. There's too much of what we call latitude, or too much dynamic range to capture all of it at once. So we're going to have to accept that some of this is going to wash out in this instance because there's just too much contrast, and we can't keep it all in one shot. But I do like this shot. It's a very good shot, but according to the histogram, we can definitely see the levels are peaked very, very bright, and the shadows are also very, very dark. If I wanted, I could take my midtones and I could brighten up the midtones to add a little more into the grass and into the trees, something like that. And that looks better. Maybe brighten it up a little bit. And too much, it starts to look nasty. We like that contrast a little bit. Maybe about like that. I could brighten up. That's just losing the hazing. I like a little more contrasty, personally. That's my opinion. But you could. I hit OK. And this is just brightening up the midtones a little bit. But the histogram we know is going to be very bright. And we saw that in the screen as well. Next, we're going to look at dodging and burning. Dodging and burning is important. Now we see here that this is a burn victim. If we look closely, that this screen at the very edges of this Nerf gun is a little bit hazy. It's kind of like a little bit of a halo effect. If you're not careful and you overdo any dodging and burning, which I'm going to talk about, it can be very noticeable that you did the edit. Now what dodging and burning is, it's actually from the black and white darkroom days. Ansel Adams, many of the great photographers, even in the 1800s, used dodging and burning using their hands to kind of shape the light in the darkroom processing to make more or less contrast, selectively to just a little part of the screen to become brighter, or for another part of the screen to become a little bit darker. We have the same tools, and Ansel Adams would have given his right arm for this to have undo buttons. Like in Photoshop, we could just say, undo, do it again. He didn't have that luxury. He had to do the whole print again and do the whole process again, and it took much more time and the chemicals. It would have been much easier if Ansel Adams would just had Photoshop. So in this highlight scene, if you remember that the sidewalk is much brighter than the flower. If we want the flower to be brighter to grab more attention, which is going to be dodged, lightened for just a little bit, and we can go ahead and burn, selectively darken some of the background, a double whammy. So if I go to my options bar over here, I'm going to go ahead and click in here. I'll see the dodge tool by default. Oh, look at the cute little puppy dog. As you notice, almost every tool in the toolbar here on the left has a little triangle next to it. That means if I click and drag, I can pull out more tools. So I go and click out the dodge tool, gives me the burn tool and the sponge tool. That's for some coloring and decoloring effect. Selectively taking away color or adding color. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to go to dodging. And I'm going to go ahead and I want to dodge this flower brighter. But before I do that, most tools have an options bar on the very top. The options bar up here allows me to take and I make adjustments to my scene. I go to my settings here and I make it much brighter. Something like that. Much better. I can also use the bracket keys, bigger or smaller. Now I want to tell you a little bit about what the hardness setting does. I'm going to do a painting setting. I have 0% hardness on a very large brush here. Let's do a 333 pixel brush at 0% hardness. Painting black, it's faint on the edges, like that. If I take my brush and I go ahead and make it 100% hardness, I can also make it very hard edge. You can see the hard edge very much. Now when we do a lot of dodging and burning, we want to go ahead and make it soft on the edges so it's not obvious that we made the edits. We want to edit, but we don't want people to know that we did an obvious edit job. Too much editing speaks for itself. It's too loud, it draws too much attention to itself, and the amateurs will be made fun of. We don't want you to be made fun of. We want you to be proud to be a photographer. So I've got my scene here. I got it brighter or darker. I can also, the third option, go to on my brush, go to opacity, and I can tone that opacity down. As it gets to a smaller number, it becomes more see-through. So if I have 38%, only 38% of that black is showing, while the other is not as thick, not as solid as the previous piece. So those are the setups of how it works. This one's free. I go to my history panel, which is right here, and I'm going to go back up into here. Now, if I ever lose a tool, I can actually find it under Windows. All my tools will be under Windows if they've gotten closed. And that's important to know too. I have my history panel. I can go back before the different settings that I did. I'm going to go back to the original open. I'm going to go back to my dodge tool. Remember the letter O for the keyboard. And I'm going to bring up a nice size brush, which I have pretty good, maybe not quite that big. Make sure it's 0% hardness. And I'm going to go ahead and now start to brighten my flower, especially the one that's sharp. I might brighten this one a little bit, but I don't want as much attention to the blurry focus. I want it to be on the sharp focused picture, not to the blurry piece. And I'm going to click there. Notice it's getting pretty bright. Good job, maybe a little bit in this one. And that helps. Now, the amount of brightness matters on the exposure settings of your options bar. If I go ahead and put it up to 100% exposure, it's going to burn a lot more intense, a lot faster. If I go to a smaller number, maybe 20 or 15 in the teens, I like to do a lot of my edits in the teens, it'll be more faint. It's happening, but it's more gradual. So you might want to play with the exposure to get a brighter or a darker dodging burning. I'm going to do the midtones. There's probably not a lot of highlights. The highlights are the bright section. A little bit of highlights in there. I'm surprised there's more highlights than I thought. Now, one thing that we want to be careful of, no matter what the exposure is, click, 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 click. Eventually, if we click too much, you sound like some type of a duck or something. Not a good idea. But every time we click, we're adding that 28 or however much percentage of our exposure, that after maybe 3, 4, 5 clicks, it's basically getting washed out and getting too bright. And if we do a lot of clicking, it becomes kind of patchy. It looks like someone's got the measles. We don't want that. Nobody needs the measles. How cruel. So I'm going to go back up to my settings here, to my couple different settings where I had, and the history panel is my friend, and that brightens it up just enough without overdoing it. Now I'm going to go to my dodge tool, pull out to my burn tool, and I'm going to burn, selectively darken the background. I'm going to go ahead and click in here, get my brush. I can also use the bracket keys next to the letter P to brighten or darken. And I'm just going to darken the background. Remember, it was already brighter than the background or the foreground to begin with. Something like that. That looks pretty good. And that's the midtones. I could probably also try one for the highlights. The highlights, that's a little bit much in the exposure. I'm going to turn my exposure down, maybe something like 20 or so. 27 it is. And that'll darken it a little bit. But I want to make sure I'm not obvious of those edges. Something like that. And I'll go before burning and after burning. Before burning and after burning. That makes a big difference to brighten up the picture appropriately. So dodging burning. Emphasize, de-emphasize. The summarizing of everything we do in photography. Now let's look at cropping. Cropping is the idea of getting rid of information that we don't want anymore, or maybe something that's distracting, or we just want to get closer to the subject, so we crop away, delete the edges of the photo to make the subject larger in the percentage of the frame. And this first piece here, the cropping here, has kind of a boring chair in the background, and a lot of other things that we don't necessarily need, even this little nip on the board. And we don't need that in here. We really want to just highlight the chess pieces. So let's do that. So we go to our crop tool right here. You can use the C for the keyboard. And I'm going to choose the crop tool. And I'm going to go ahead and select in here and how I want to crop it. Now, if for some reason you've maybe had it edited before, if it's not the default settings, you might have some interesting settings up in here in the options panel for a ratio, which means it's always going to be that same proportion. You can't crop freehand. So you may need to clear those settings. You clear those settings, and now I can crop cinematic and dramatic, or I can crop it wide or tall, or Instagram style. I can crop it in any direction. So I've got my ratio set up here. I want to crop out just below that little piece right there, about like that. There. And I'm going to use this grid that it gives me to make sure that this pawn is near the middle. With that pawn near the middle, about like that. And then I hit Enter to accept, or escape to cancel, or I can click these buttons right here for the accept or to cancel. I accept, and there, I've cropped out all the distractions. So crop makes a big difference to making the emphasis a little bit stronger. Kind of a free section to go along with crop. So now let's take a look at the straighten tool. Obviously, we can see from the shot that the cross is a little bit crooked. And you look at it closely, it's crooked. It's not just your head. You don't have vertigo. It is actually crooked. So what do we do about it? Do we just say, oh well? No, that's not a good response. A good photographer makes it right all the time. So if you have the crop tool open already, which if you do, C for the shortcut if you don't, we're going to go up to the options bar here and look for the straighten button. Under straighten, it looks like a little level, like you level something out if you're in construction. I click the straighten, and I'm going to go ahead and click and drag a line from point here to point there. And I want to drag it to make it all the way horizontal with a cross. And what that will do is it will now adjust based on that setting. And it will crop that straighter. So basically I do that line. And now what will happen, it will crop in a little bit or adjust the whole frame. And when I hit enter, I'm going to lose a little bit of the sides. So do be cautious that you will lose a little bit of the sides of your picture by doing this. I hit accept, and bravo. Now it is straightened based on the level that I did in the picture. Groundbreakingly easy, super important. Make sure you do it. Now we're going to look at image resizing. Now with this picture, it looks nice, but if I go ahead and zoom in, I hit Control 1 or Command 1 on a Mac, and it makes it 100% size. This is the size that it will be on the actual pixel for pixel, seeing every single pixel. It's much larger than my 4K monitor, and I can see a lot in my 4K monitor. So it's probably too large to do things like for internet uses, putting it on a website, maybe for emailing, it might be too large. So how to resize it? Well, I'm using the spacebar now to navigate. If I hold spacebar, it uses the hand tool. You can also find it on the toolbar here, the hand tool, which allows me to navigate, kind of click and drag through the piece in a nice way instead of using the side and the other side piece. That doesn't work as well. So I use the hand tool to make it there. I can also hit Control 0. Control 0 makes it fit the screen and to fit as big as possible in my Photoshop window. So to resize it, I'm going to go to Image, Image Size, and under Image Size, I can see my pixel count is very large. This is great if I want to print it. If I shoot a nice camera today, some of the cameras are shooting 20, 30, 40, 50 megapixel, and that's wonderful if you want to print a big poster or you want to print prints. Now the key when you get into resizing is we want to make sure that we resize this as a different file. So if I save it as a different file, that's good. If I resize this, maybe to make it small for the internet, 1280, this is locked, so everything gets smaller. I hit OK. And notice it is much smaller in the screen now. That being said, if it's smaller in the screen, well, the problem is if I save over this, I go File and Save, which it will kind of let you know it's supposed to be a Photoshop file, which is good. There's some protections in Photoshop. But if I accidentally save over my original file, I can no longer print it at a high quality because my image size is much smaller. So make sure you size it appropriately if you need for a screen or for email. But don't forget to save it as a different copy. To do this, you do File, you do Save as Copy. It pops up a screen. It says you want a JPEG. It'll add copy in the list so it doesn't override over the same name. You can hit yes, that's okay. It'll pop up a menu. What's the size of my JPEG? Now, if you're going to print something, which if you're resizing small, it probably means you're not. But if you're going to print something, I would keep it at a higher size, maybe 10. Most of my stuff I do at 10. 11, 12 is fine. High quality, bigger file size. Now, if you're going to put something on the web or internet file or email, I might put it somewhere in the middle. You'd be surprised, right about 5, you can tell here 119 kilobytes. Instead of at full size, it would be 690 kilobytes. So we're talking like 5 to 6 times smaller resolution just by going to 5. So keep it as small. You might want to optimize for small. You hit OK, and it's done. Your picture is now full size right there. Now for number 5, we're going to look at basic touch-up. Obviously, the big one is acne, blemishes on the face. We can touch this out actually pretty easily. If we go to our tools here, and we go to this options bar, If you go down to the toolbar, about a third of the way down, maybe, go to Spot Healing Brush. Shortcut for this is J. And using already the settings that are there, I'm going to go ahead and just click the acne and drag over it. And it does a pretty good job of removing them. Sometimes it takes a couple different attempts to remove the acne. Yes, I know what you're thinking. You wish you had an acne. I know what you're thinking. You wish you had a healing brush for real life. Unfortunately, we don't. But if we did, I would market it and make millions of dollars. And that does a pretty good job touching on acne. The big thing you want to be careful is not growing too big of dots. The bigger the dots, the more glitchy it'll get. It's going to have a hard time merging those two together. Now, Photoshop, with the artificial intelligence, the AI, has gotten pretty good at how it does this automatic sensing. It's automatic and it does a pretty good job. Now, for some things, that might work just fine. Other times, maybe certain stubborn little bits of pieces of your model, you might want to use a clone stamp tool. There's times I might go to my clone stamp tool, and I'll click, use the settings that are there, and I'll use Alt on the keyboard, kind of like hunting like a gun. You get the crosshairs, and I click where I want. I let go of Alt, make my bracket keys to make my brush bigger, and I'll click, and you see the little plus sign. That's where it's taking from, the little plus sign, and it's moving it to this side where the circle is going. And it helps to remove that piece. Now, if you're not careful, you start dragging, you eventually have kind of this blotchy looking piece, especially with long edits. So a lot of times I'll use lots of clicks. Alt, and you want to skip from the same sample. See the color that is different? Alt, Alt click, Alt click. And this isn't doing a great job for this instance, but there's times you might want to use the manual control of the clone stamp tool, where you can choose exactly where it's going, and use the healing brush. A lot of times works well for acne. Let's go to the other piece I had. I have my touch-up piece. For this leaf here, it's just one random leaf. It was lots of leaves on the table would be different, but one random leaf, I'm going to go ahead and touch it up. So I can go ahead and use my spot healing brush if I want, and just kind of click and drag on it. And that actually did a pretty good edge. Not perfect. You can see there's edges here that need to be touched back up a couple times. But it did all right. Not bad, following the grain of the wood. That looks pretty good. If I want it, I'll sometimes come in with my clone stamp brush, and I'll just kind of click and drag a little bit pieces to kind of finish it up. What I'll do, if I want the more finessing, I'll go to my opacity, and I'll turn it down maybe somewhere in the middle, like 50% or so. So only 50% of that is changing, not 100%. That helps to hide all my imperfections. But now that you know touch-up, remember to always use it responsibly and ethically, and also have fun. It's a fun tool. You can do a lot with it. Remember, you may not be a photography expert, but you can be a genius.